Don't look away from the screens. That is the one golden rule of the night shift. Never take your eyes off the feeds. I broke it. And now, I am sitting in this pitch-black control room, clutching a useless flashlight with trembling hands, listening to someone, or something, slowly turning the handle of the only metal door keeping me alive. I can hear it. The heavy, wet breathing just inches away from the other side of the steel. It is a slow, methodical rasp. My heart is pounding out of my chest, echoing so loudly in my own ears. I am terrified the intruder can hear it too. I am paralyzed by fear. A cold sweat is stinging my eyes. But to understand the true, suffocating horror of this exact moment, I need to take you back to exactly 2 hours ago, when the first monitor flickered and the nightmare began. It was 2:15 in the morning. The silence in the claustrophobic security room was absolute, almost deafening. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. The only sounds were the low, steady hum of the server racks and the faint, relentless pattering of rain against the single reinforced window high up on the concrete wall. The air inside was stale, smelling faintly of old coffee, dust, and ozone. I sat in a worn-out leather chair, staring blankly at the bank of 12 glowing monitors. They displayed the different, desolate sectors of the abandoned industrial complex I was paid to watch over. Most nights were incredibly boring. Just empty, endless hallways, dusty, shadowy warehouse floors, and the occasional stray dog wandering near the perimeter fence. I usually spent the time reading paperback novels or listening to a crackling AM radio, just letting the quiet, lonely night pass by. But tonight felt different. The air felt heavy, suffocating. A cold draft seemed to seep directly through the solid concrete walls, making a severe chill run down my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a primal reaction to an unseen threat. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I told myself it was just the extreme isolation playing nasty tricks on my tired mind. Then, my eyes drifted to the bottom left screen. Camera 04, the rusty front gate. The rain was coming down hard now, a torrential downpour distorting the black and white image into a muddy, gray blur. But through the grainy static and the weak, sickly yellow glow of a distant street lamp, I saw it. A dark, imposing silhouette standing right outside the heavy iron bars of the gate. It was a person. They were unnaturally tall, their limbs appearing too long, too thin. They were wearing a heavy, dark hoodie that completely obscured their face, casting their features into deep, impenetrable shadows. They were not trying to climb the tall fence. They were not trying to pick the heavy padlock. They were just standing there, perfectly, unnaturally still. And they were looking up, directly into the lens of the camera, staring at me, through the screen. The blood in my veins ran ice cold. The previous silence of the room suddenly felt incredibly oppressive, like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, my breath hitching painfully in my throat. I desperately told myself it was probably just a drunk wandering the lonely, flooded industrial roads, a homeless person seeking shelter from the severe storm. But their posture was all wrong. It was too rigid, too still, too intentional. They stood with their arms hanging loosely at their sides, the heavy rain pounding against their shoulders, completely unfazed by the freezing downpour. I watched them for what felt like an absolute eternity. 10 minutes passed in agonizing silence, then 20. The dark figure did not move a single muscle, not even a twitch. The steady, rhythmic drops of rain on the metal roof above me felt like a loud, ticking clock, echoing the frantic, terrified beating of my own heart. I grabbed my thermos with trembling, clammy hands, taking a small sip of lukewarm coffee to try and calm my shattered nerves. "It is just a prank," I whispered to myself. My voice sounded incredibly weak and hollow in the small, lonely room, just some teenagers messing around in the dark. But deep down, In the pit of my stomach, I knew that was a lie. A primal instinct, buried deep in my DNA, was screaming at me to run. A loud warning that I was in severe danger, that I was being hunted. I kept my wide eyes glued to the flickering screen, terrified that if I blinked, they would disappear. The static on the monitor flared violently for a split second, a jagged tier of white noise across the image. And in that brief, terrifying moment of visual distortion, I swore I saw the tall figure tilt their head slightly to the side. An unnatural, jerky, almost mechanical movement, like a hungry predator locking onto its trapped prey. I reached over to the metal control panel, my fingers hesitating over the red intercom button. I could announce my presence. I could yell, tell them the police were already on their way, but my throat felt completely tight. I was too scared to make a single sound, too terrified to let this thing know I was watching it back. So I just sat there, frozen in my chair, trapped in a silent, agonizing staring contest with a faceless nightmare. The hands on the wall clock ticked slowly past 2:45. The heavy figure remained firmly planted on the wet, black asphalt. I needed to call my supervisor. I needed to get someone, anyone else on the line, just to hear another living, human voice. I reached into my jacket pocket for my cell phone, glancing down for no more than 3 seconds to unlock the glowing screen. 1, 2, 3. 3 seconds. That was all it took. When I snapped my head back up to look at the bank of monitors, my heart stopped completely. Camera 04 was empty. The empty screen stared back at me. Just rain and rusty iron. My breath caught in my throat. I frantically scanned the other 11 monitors. Sector 1, Sector 2. Nothing. Just empty shadows and flickering lights. Where did they go? They could not have just vanished into thin air. I grabbed the heavy metal joystick to pan camera 04, scanning the dark perimeter. Nothing but wet concrete and dead weeds. Then, a sharp hiss of static blasted from the audio monitor. The harsh sound echoed in the tiny room, making me jump out of my skin. My eyes darted to camera 03, the loading dock. It was located at the far end of the facility, a solid half-mile walk from the front gate. But the screen was tearing. Waves of thick gray distortion rolled violently across the image. Through the heavy static, I saw a shape moving in the deep, heavy shadows. It was the tall figure. They were already inside the perimeter. How did they move so incredibly fast? It was physically impossible. I leaned closer to the audio speaker, trembling uncontrollably. Through the crackling noise of the storm, I heard a terrible sound, a heavy, wet thud, followed by a slow, agonizing drag. Thud, drag, thud, drag. It was the sound of heavy, mud-caked boots dragging something heavy across the rough concrete floor of the loading dock. My stomach tied itself into cold knots. Utter panic began to set in. What were they dragging? I reached for the radio again, my fingers fumbling with the hard plastic dial. But before I could press the talk button, camera 03 went completely black. A single line of white text blinked in the center of the dead screen. Signal lost. My mouth went completely dry. They knew where the cameras were. They were destroying them. And then, the true horror of the situation finally hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I looked at the facility map pinned to the peeling wall next to my desk. Camera 03 was the loading dock. Camera 07 was the east wing hallway. Camera 09 was the main stairwell. And camera 11 was the hallway right outside my security room door. I looked back at the screens. Camera 07 was located halfway between the loading dock and my current position. The screen flickered violently. A long, narrow hallway illuminated by a single flickering fluorescent tube. The shadows stretched and danced erratically along the cracked plaster walls. I stared at the dark end of the hallway, holding my breath until my lungs burned. The audio feed crackled to life. The heavy, wet thud and drag was much louder now, much closer. A shadow separated itself from the absolute darkness at the end of the corridor. The tall figure stepped into the dim, sickly yellow light. They were moving differently now, no longer still. They were walking with a strange, unnatural gait, their long limbs swinging awkwardly in the tight space. The dark hood still completely hid their face, but I could feel their gaze. A cold, piercing awareness that drilled straight through the camera lens and into my very soul. They were looking right at me again. They knew I was watching. They were playing a sick, terrifying game of hide and seek, and I was the trapped prey. I watched in absolute frozen terror as the figure slowly raised a long, pale hand. They reached up toward the ceiling, their impossibly long fingers wrapping around the metal casing of camera 07. The screen violently shook. The audio feed screeched with the horrific sound of tearing metal and snapping wires. Then, dead blackness. Signal lost. The darkness in the security room felt heavier now, pressing in on me from all sides. I was rapidly losing my eyes. I was being blinded, piece by piece, as this monster systematically moved closer. The only thing separating us was a maze of dark, empty corridors, and they were navigating it perfectly. I grabbed my cell phone with shaking, sweaty hands and frantically dialed 911. The screen glowed weakly in the dark room. No service. The storm must have knocked out the cell tower, or the thick concrete walls of the underground complex were blocking the signal. I slammed the phone down onto the desk in absolute, helpless frustration. I was completely alone, completely isolated. I stared at the remaining monitors. The East Wing was entirely blind. The figure was moving toward the central stairwell. Camera 09. I waited in suffocating silence. Every single creak of the old building, every gust of wind rattling the metal roof, sounded exactly like approaching footsteps. The anticipation was absolute torture. My heart was a frantic drum beating against my ribs. And then, the screen for camera 09 flickered. The stairwell. The figure was already there, standing at the bottom of the concrete steps. They did not look up at the camera this time. They just began to climb. One slow, deliberate step at a time. The heavy boots echoed with a sickening thud against the hard concrete. Thud, thud, thud. They were coming up to my floor. I backed away from the desk, my legs trembling so violently I could barely stand. I knocked over my coffee cup, sending lukewarm liquid spilling across the floor, but I did not care. I retreated into the darkest corner of the room, squeezing myself between a tall metal filing cabinet and the cold, damp concrete wall. I pulled my knees to my chest, making myself as small as possible. The screen for camera 09 went black. Signal lost. Only one camera remained between me and the intruder. Camera 11, the hallway right outside my door. I stared at the last glowing square, my eyes wide with unblinking primal terror. Camera 11 was the only active monitor left in the entire complex. It showed the narrow, brightly lit hallway right outside my heavy metal security door. For a long, agonizing minute, the screen was empty, just the flickering fluorescent light reflecting off the dirty linoleum floor. I held my breath, listening to the suffocating silence. The air in my small room felt incredibly thin, as if the oxygen was being slowly sucked out through the cracks. Then, a long, dark shadow crept into the frame from the left side of the screen.
Get out!
The tall, hooded figure stepped slowly into the harsh light of the corridor. They were standing mere feet away from me now, separated only by a few inches of steel and concrete. The heavy rain dripped steadily from their dark coat, forming a dark, muddy puddle on the clean floor. They slowly turned their head, their invisible face pointing directly at the camera lens. They stood perfectly still for what felt like an absolute eternity, savoring the pure terror they were inflicting upon me. And then, they slowly raised their long, pale right arm and pointed a single, impossibly long finger directly at the camera, directly at me. They knew exactly where I was hiding. I could not breathe. I could not move. The figure suddenly lunged forward with terrifying speed, their massive hand violently grabbing the camera casing. The monitor exploded into a chaotic, screaming mess of static, and then total blackness. Signal lost. The entire bank of monitors was now dead, displaying nothing but empty black squares. The only light left in my claustrophobic control room was the faint, weak, dying yellow glow of my emergency flashlight. And then, the absolute worst sound in the entire world broke the heavy silence. Heavy, muddy boots stepping onto the linoleum floor right outside my physical door. Squish, thud, squish, thud. The heavy, wet footsteps stopped right in front of the door. The floorboards groaned and creaked under their immense, imposing weight. And that brings us to right now, the exact moment I started this story. I am sitting in the pitch-black dark, clutching my useless flashlight, listening to the heavy, wet breathing just inches away from the other side of the steel. The heavy brass doorknob is slowly, agonizingly starting to turn. It is clicking and rattling loudly as they test the strength of the lock. I am completely trapped. I have absolutely nowhere left to run. A low, raspy, inhuman voice, sounding exactly like grinding wet stones, suddenly whispers through the narrow gap under the door. "I know you are in there," it says, dragging out every single syllable. I close my eyes tightly, clamp my hands over my ears, and pray for the morning sun. I stayed huddled in that corner, paralyzed by sheer terror, for 6 agonizing hours. The true horror, however, did not end that night. The local police finally arrived just after dawn, breaking down the main gate and storming the abandoned facility. They found me huddled under the metal desk, completely traumatized, shaking uncontrollably, but physically unharmed. The heavy metal security door had seemingly saved my life. Or so I desperately thought. Because when the lead detective walked up to inspect the heavy door, his face went completely pale. He looked at me with deep, pitying eyes and told me a horrifying truth that still haunts my nightmares every single night. The intruder was never trying to break into the security room. The heavy deadbolt on the outside of the door had been completely jammed with broken pieces of sharp metal and thick wire. They had intentionally locked me inside. And when the police forensics team reviewed the backup server footage from the hours before the cameras were systematically destroyed, they finally saw why. The tall, hooded figure had not come to the facility alone. While he distracted me on camera 04, forcing me to watch him in paralyzed fear, something else, something incredibly small, fast, and completely distorted on the grainy footage, had crawled up the side of the building and into the main ventilation shaft. The exact same ventilation shaft that leads directly into the ceiling of the enclosed security control room. They did not lock me in to keep me safe. They locked me in with it. And as I sit here telling you this story, hiding in my own supposedly safe bedroom, I can still hear the faint, rhythmic scratching sounds coming from inside my own walls at night. It followed me home. If you ever work the lonely night shift by yourself, make sure you always look up. Check the dark vents. And if you want to survive the true hidden horrors of this dark world, make sure you subscribe to Mr. Horror right now for more terrifying encounters. Share your own creepy stories in the comments below, if you dare. The terrifying stories I have planned for next week will be even more disturbing than this. Lock your doors, stay safe, and never, ever look away from the dark.